Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Movies of 2019. Now, the first thing you might notice is that this video is coming out in April of 2020, so I'm rather late with this. I have been doing this on my channel ever since 2014, but usually I release them right at New Year's, at least at the start of January, because that's when everyone else releases their best, top 10 movies of the year, because that makes most sense. You do it right at the end of the year, looking back on the year. But for this year, I was way too busy around the end of the year mark. I had tons and tons of shows I was reviewing that came out. Like every single show I liked seemed to drop all at once. And it came out around like November, December, and then in January I did a trip overseas to New Zealand for a month, and I was busy with that. So I was way too busy to do this video. Now it's not just about doing the video; I also have to see the movies, because usually every year there's a bunch of the Oscar bait movies that are dropped right at the end of the year, so usually I have to scramble at the end of the year to watch all these movies to make sure I've seen enough movies to compile a list. But I couldn't do that this year because I was way too busy with everything else. So a lot of these movies I've seen over the past 3 or 4 months. In 2020, I've been watching the movies that came out at the end of 2019 so I could get a full picture, because I don't think at the end of, at the New Year's, I've probably only seen 15 movies. Now I've seen 27 movies, so I'm a bit more, I just slowly watched them over the past couple of months, and plus getting to watch a whole bunch of movies on the 12-hour flight from New Zealand to America also helped. Anyway, so I've seen about 27 movies, so I'm here to talk about my top 10 favorite movies of 2019, and of course I'm not including any movies that came out in 2020 that I'll be saving for next year, which hopefully I'll get to do a bit closer to the turn of the year. Anyway, usually what I do before I get into my top 10, I will name the worst movie of the year, and as always I have to give the little caveat that it's not, I try to avoid bad movies. Like, you watch a lot of YouTube videos from movie critics or YouTube critics, and they'll often have top 10 lists of all these horrible, crappy movies that they had to sit through, because as a critic they want to go see as many movies as possible, which I don't have to do that. So I never see enough bad movies to make a top 10 list, because I try to avoid watching bad movies. But even when trying to avoid watching bad movies, once in a while you will stumble across one that's not very good, which I did this year. So I'll name my number one worst movie of 2019 that I saw, and that is a movie called Io, which was aired on Netflix, and has, you'll see in my list, Netflix movies are fair game. I don't discount them if they weren't released in the movie theaters. I made that rule last year, and so that makes this movie Io eligible for worst movie. This was by far the worst movie I saw. So I'm a fan of The Expanse, and I actually like sci-fi, and I think that the concept of doing having stuff take place on existing moons in our solar system is very interesting. But the movie Io actually wasn't about that. It was a really, really boring movie. And the other reason I really wanted to see this movie is because it stars the actress who played Jill on The Leftovers, who I thought was amazing in that show. So I was like, oh, she's starring in this movie, I have to see it. But this movie was so boring. It didn't really accomplish much. It was just about, everyone had left the Earth, and there was only a few people left, and this guy, Anthony Mackie, shows up to kill the scientists, but just finds his daughter, and his daughter keeps lying, saying that her father's out, but really he's died a long time ago, and so the two of them form this relationship of blue, blah, blue, blah, blah, and it's just so boring. I literally fell asleep during this movie. I would recommend it to anyone who has problems, insomnia or whatnot. And Here's the other thing I couldn't get over. I was hoping this movie would explain why the human race decided to move to Io, because that seems like the worst possible place you could possibly move to, and the movie never comes up with an excuse for this. I certainly think that the script writers don't even know what Io is like. They just think it has a cool sounding name, so let's say they moved there. Like, there's another movie on Netflix. I can't remember if it was actually called Titan. Maybe it was called Titans, where the human race tries to go to the Titan, which it's further away because it's on Saturn, but at least it makes some lick of sense. Like, there are a lot better candidates. Okay, even in The Expanse, where all these moons and asteroids are colonized, they haven't colonized Io. They just have a couple of, like, industrial, like, mining facilities there because it's a hostile moon. So why the hell would the human race pick that one, the worst place they could anyway, I don't know. This movie was terrible. So, moving on to my favorite movies of 2019, let me start, as always, with a couple honorable mentions that didn't quite make my top 10 list. First honorable mention I want to talk about is A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, Tom Hanks movie about Mr. Rogers, which it was heartfelt. I mean, it wasn't the best thing ever. It was a bit ordinary. I've seen movies like this a lot, but it was effective in being a heartfelt story about a son and his estranged father and them reuniting. So, good enough for that. And plus, darn Mr. Rogers for good measure. Next honorable mention is Booksmart. This was big. I described this movie as Superbad, but with girls instead of boys. And I'm actually, to be honest, I know it's like seen as this huge, like, legend, a comedy legend, but I'm actually never been a huge fan of Superbad. Honestly, Superbad was just taking the same format I've seen in the 80s and 90s over and over again. I think it's maybe the younger generation that likes that movie. But I did like this incarnation, and I don't think it was just Superbad with girls. Like, they did, it was actually a bit of an intelligent comedy. With some good acting, so I thought it was pretty decent. Next honorable mention is Hotel Mumbai, which this is a really horroring film, kind of in the same vein as like a Schindler's List. It kind of, I mean, the name sounds like Hotel Rwanda, and I guess it's kind of similar, except with less hope, if you can imagine that, because it's about a terrorist attack in Mumbai and how the terrorists take over this hotel, and a lot of the main characters die, which a lot of these historical movies about horrible events, terrorist attacks, wars, or whatever, tend to have most of their main characters survive or tend to have some lick of hope. And this movie does have a lick of hope, but it's very dismal, but it has some really good acting, very good writing in it, so it was a good movie. Anyway, now let me get into my top 10 favorite movies of 2019. Let's start with my number 10, Spider-Man Far From Home. Really enjoyed this movie, of course. Huge fan of the MCU, huge fan of this incarnation of Spider-Man. Loved Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio, a villain I've been wanting to see for a very long time. And yeah, at times it get a bit cheesy, comic booky, over the top, but for the most part, I thought it was a very effective movie. And I love personally the personal relationship between Peter Parker and Mary J, or MJ, I guess they're calling her. I thought that was one of the strengths of the movie. The comedy with the teachers I thought was dumb and brought the movie down, but overall, it was a pretty powerful movie. So anyway, let me get into my number 9, which is A Marriage Story. This is a movie my friends insisted that I watch, and it has amazing acting. Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver are great in this movie. Like, the dialogue is on point. It hit a bit too close to home in a couple of places. And it was very realistic. It wasn't really Hollywoodified. Like a lot of, even some of these Oscar bait movies, or particularly like Green Book or whatever, are really Hollywoodified, where this one wasn't. It felt a lot more true to real life, and it was very well written, and it does its job as being very emotionally powerful. So, now let me get into my number 8, which is Joker. I didn't expect to like this movie as much as I did, even though I heard everyone saying it's not your typical comic book movie. But I've heard that it had heavily influenced by Martin Scorsese, and that's what turned me off, because I'm not a fan of Martin Scorsese. Sorry. I mean, he's a great director, technically, but I just can't get into his particular style. So when I heard that this was taking from his style, I thought, oh, I'm probably not going to like it. But I actually did end up liking it. I think it did an amazing job of tackling the issue of mental illness, and in a very dark way, because it certainly doesn't present the Joker as a protagonist. Or I would fight against even the term anti-hero, which I've heard some people use for this character. I think he is a tragic figure, is how I would describe this character, because you're not supposed to empathize or sympathize with the horrible stuff that he does, but you're supposed to see how the breakdown in society and how the apathy that was generated by policy and just societal norms was the result of this horror, and the angst that came up around him that supported this horror, even though it was undirected horror, because the Joker himself in this movie makes it clear that he doesn't care about politics or political station. He's just messed up in the head, and he's been neglected by a system that just didn't give a fuck about him. And so that aspect of it I thought was extremely powerful. But the fact that they had to make this a Joker movie, and they couldn't just make this an original IP, that they had to attach it to something greater established, and they have these stupid obligatory, oh, here's Bruce Wayne and his father, whatever, I can't remember what his father's name is, and how they had to incorporate them into the story was a bit silly, like. So that's why it didn't get maybe a bit higher, but still a great movie. Anyway, let me get to my number 7, which is Dr. Sleep. It's the sequel, very underrated movie in my opinion, although some other critics did really love it. It didn't do well at the box office and doesn't seem to be getting much love. But Dr. Sleep is the sequel to The Shining, a movie I think is incredibly overrated in contrast to where I think this is underrated. And I gotta be honest, I actually like this movie better than The Shining, and that might sound like blasphemy, but just keep in mind, I didn't think The Shining was all that great. I talked about The Shining on my channel before, how I just think that Jack Nicholson really telegraphs that the guy's going to go insane, because he's acting insane at the start of the movie, so I didn't really get the point of it, and I thought it went on too long and was a bit too up his own ass. Where Dr. Sleep, actually, it turns it more into less of a, like, it has those elements of psychological horror, but it also has an element of, like, an action conflict where you have a sect of people trying to hunt down another people who are just trying to survive, and that I actually find that conflict a lot more interesting, and plus they do such a great job with the personal character stories in this film that you really identified with them, so I just thought it was much more effective personally. Anyway, let me get into my number 6, which is 1917, a movie I just saw yesterday. And this, it's a shame I couldn't see it in the theaters, because it was very cinematic. It was very, at least I didn't see it on a tiny screen on the airplane. At least I got to see it on the bigger screen at home, and my home system, whatever. But anyway, yeah, it's basically shot kind of the same way as Birdman, like the one-shot effect. And I was hesitant to see this movie, because I thought at first that all it would be, just, ooh, look at how pretty this movie is, which I like, but that isn't all there is to it. I think the movie actually does a great job in its storytelling and following the characters and the journey that he goes through. It was quite powerful in the bits of moments that he has and the character journey that he takes throughout the film. And there's a lot. It's a very unpredictable movie as well, even though it is very simple. It was basically about one person going on a quest during the war, and the fact it is in real time for the most part does make it give them sort of less room to develop. But I think they did a great job with this format, and it's definitely an incredibly impactful film, I shall say. Anyway, let me now get to my number 5, which is I Am Mother. So when I talked about the worst movie, that was a sci-fi movie on Netflix, and Netflix original movies tend not to be good. Let's be honest here. And the exception, of course, is the Oscar bait movies that they have, like The Irishman and Roma and a few others that come out around Oscar time. But usually, especially with sci-fi Netflix films, they tend not to be good. But this one, so I was surprised when I watched I Am Mother, because this was actually a really great film. And if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend seeing it. It's a sort of post-apocalyptic world where there's only one human survivor, and she's being raised by a robot who's known as Mother. And even though I saw the twist in this film coming from a million miles away, didn't make it any less impactful. It didn't make it any less powerful, because not everything has to be a big shock. You can do predictable correct if the point of the movie isn't the shock. The point of the movie is how it affects the characters and how the character journey works, and shedding light on the whole sort of situation. And that's what I think this ending did. And I thought the acting in it was amazingly great, even though and especially for a child actor, even though if she didn't always do a good job at hiding her Australian accent, I could hear it come out every once in a while. Why don't they just set it in Australia? Why do they have to set it in America? Because it's made in Australia. But anyway, this is a really great sci-fi film. I liked it more than Ex Machina, which I think is highly overrated, personally, just my opinion. So I like this better than some of the revered sci-fi films, so I definitely would recommend it. Anyway, let me get into my number 4, which is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Love Quentin Tarantino always, but it's not like he can do no wrong. He's certainly done no wrong before, and I think a couple of his movies, like Inglourious Basterds, is a little bit overrated. This one, I think, was actually really great. I think it's a bit underrated. Of course, like, the dialogue and the acting was amazing. Now, some people complain that it's really boring because it's a really long film, and most of it, I guess nothing really happens until that end. But oh my God, some people had a problem with that ending sequence, but I absolutely loved it, even though it was over the top. But that's Tarantino for you. You have to have an over the top, violent scene like that, and I think it paid off in spades. But throughout the film, I thought there was and here we have Jill from The Leftovers as an appearance in this film, and a much better film. But anyway, like how it gets into the minds of this washed-up actor and this stunt guy who's had a ruined reputation, and the dynamics that they play. Like, to me, that was more interesting than any of its sort of alternate history type thing. Although, I gotta say, I love that fucking ending. Anyway, let me get into my number 3, third favorite movie of the year, and that is Jojo Rabbit. This is probably, if you ask me, out of all the movies that were nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars, this is the one I think should have won. Parasite won. I did see that. It was decent. Like, it didn't quite make my list because I didn't think it was all that great. It was okay. I personally prefer this one. I think it was. I think this is one of Taika Waititi's best films. Of course, huge fan of Taika Waititi, having lived in New Zealand for so long. He's a very well-known New Zealand director, and he's well-known internationally now as well, for good reason, because he makes really high-quality films. And this, of course, is I think this is his first film that he's done since doing Thor Ragnarok, which, excelled him more on the international stage as a really well-known director.
You might have to fact check me on that. Maybe he did Hunt for the Wilder People after Thor. I can't remember. But anyway, it's one of the more prestigious films, the non-comic book films that he's ever done, because it has like Scarlett Johansson and God, that other dude, his name is escaping me at the moment. But it was a really great film. I think it was really effective character story, the way Taika Waititi does. I think the comedy mixes seamlessly into this very, like, some people thought it was ridiculous to have a comedy set during Germany in World War II times about, like, a kid who sees an imaginary Hitler. Like, and I could see why a lot of people were really turned off by that premise. But it amazingly works well, and of course having the protagonist be someone who buys into all this, the Nazi propaganda, might seem a bit turning off as well, but the journey he goes through and what he learns, that all that is just nonsense and BS, and all the characters around him are just so well developed, even though you can't really empathize with them, but they do the comedy. Like, sometimes it's a bit over the top, but I think it works so well in conjunction to the powerful themes of this movie. So I think it is an accomplishment, in my opinion. Anyway, let me get to my number 2, second favorite movie of the year, and I'm going back to Netflix. So some people might not consider this eligible, and some people think I'm having this way too high, but I'm going to say my number 2 second favorite movie of the year is El Camino. Now, I think I like this movie a lot more than most people. If I did a full-length review for this movie, I gave it a 10 out of 10, and I stand firmly by this. Now, if you're not familiar, El Camino is the movie sequel to Breaking Bad that shows what happened to Jesse after the finale of Breaking Bad. And some people thought, I've heard the word unnecessary thrown out so many times by critics when describing this movie, and I could not possibly disagree more with that assessment. I think this movie was incredibly necessary. I think it was one of the most necessary. I think it was way more necessary than fucking 75% of movies that are made. I don't even get why that's the question, whether or not this movie is necessary. I think from a Breaking Bad perspective, it ties up the loose end of Jesse Pinkman, which wasn't really tied up in the show itself, which I can understand why, because that show was Walter White's story. So they had to create something independent that's apart from Breaking Bad, but kind of continues from it, but it's more focused on Jesse Pinkman's story. And I love the juxtaposition of Pinkman's story as compared to Walter White's, because Walter White's was, of course, a tragic downfall of how the rise and fall of someone who let his ego turn him into a crime lord. Whereas Jesse Pinkman is someone who has kind of the opposite journey, and it's about him trying to earn his freedom and come back from such a dark place. And this movie, a lot of people think it's too slow-paced or boring, but I thought it was, I would use the word very contemplative. And I think it's absolutely an amazing character story in the vein of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. It probably has a more tinge of Better Call Saul, though, because it's a lot slower paced and more introspective, and it's not as action packed as some fans of Breaking Bad might expect it to be. But as I said, I did a full length review where I totally analyzed this movie, and I think from start to finish they do an amazing job at having this character story and earning his ending. So I thought it was an amazing film. So now let me get into my number 1 favorite film of 2019, and that is Avengers Endgame. Now, I've done a couple of videos, like I did the Marvel MCU Phase 3 Part 2, where I talked about this movie, and I think I did a live discussion video with my brother when this movie first came out. So if you've seen either of them, you'll know that this is my favorite MCU movie ever. even after I watched this movie the second time, especially because I watched every single MCU movie in order, and after doing that, I appreciate this movie so much more. I think this movie is an accomplishment, and I said before, I'll say it again, this is one of my favorite movies of all time now. I'll put it right, I mean, it may even make my top 10 of movies of all time. I think this movie is an accomplishment, because especially if you watch the MCU in order, you see how much it pays off all of the storylines, and that they're able to do it in one movie is really amazing. But on top of that, and some people say they prefer Infinity War over this, which I don't think there's a statement about movies I could disagree with more. To be honest, I think this movie is like a billion times better than Infinity War, because this is more, I guess it's my taste, because my taste is I prefer more character-based stories and more plot-heavy stories. And I think this is really true to the characters in the MCU. And it really fleshes out their characters. And even though there is your fair amount of action, as there always has to be in a Marvel movie, I see it more as a character-based film than most Marvel movies are. And on top of that, they managed to tie up all these loose threads and just I love how emotionally impactful this film is, and how it deals, because Infinity War is more action based, and it ends with, half, spoilers for that, but come on guys. But anyway, it ends with half the population being wiped out, and so that's all well and good for that. But this film deals with the emotional consequences, the real-life consequences. How does this affect our characters? And how some people are resigned to deal with this, how some people want to go back and change it. And I am a huge fan of time travel. If ever you throw in time travel to something, that makes me more interested. Now, time travel is not always done right. There's a lot of cases that they really foul it up and make it quite horrible. But this case in particular, I think, is one of the best uses of time travel I've ever seen, and I stand by that. And I think this movie is particularly flawless. I've heard a lot of people try to nitpick and say there's holes in the plot. I would argue against them and say that they didn't actually understand the movie if they feel that way, that it is actually a very tightly explained movie with very few plot holes, unlike Infinity War, which was just riddled with plot holes. But anyway, I love this film, if I'm not making this clear. And yeah, there were some fan servicey moments in the big battle at the end, but they were earned. See, I usually use the term fan service to describe a movie that just be like, throw in something that actually doesn't work for the characters, doesn't have anything to do with the plot, doesn't help the story at all. They just throw it in there just to give a wink and a nod to the fans. That's what I consider fan service. That is not what they did in this film. What they did in the film was definitely, stuff that fans wanted to see, and was a wink and a nod to the fans, but it worked for the characters. It bettered the character stories. It bettered the plot. It bettered the movie. So I guess I would redefine fan service and say that is the good kind and not the bad kind. That brings the quality of a movie down, because it has nothing to do with anything. With this, enhanced this amazing story. So I think this movie's an accomplishment. To be honest, I think this is one of the best movies ever made, and I'm going to stand by that. Anyway, that is it for my top 10 movies of 2019. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel, as I cover many other TV shows mostly. I cover a lot of Star Trek, Better Call Saul, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.